Thank you, Holly. Good afternoon, and welcome to part one of our Widely Attended Gatherings massive open online course. I'm Patrick Shepard, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Cheryl Kim-Piasecki. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks very much, Patrick.
So what are we going to be doing today?
Well, we're going to be doing several things today. First of all, I think on the agenda is we want to talk a little bit about why widely attended gathering, why does that exception exist? Because our experience has been that sometimes folks are ready to jump to the WAG exception without really appreciating that it isn't sort of the only authority or the exclusive authority to allow acceptance of free attendance at certain events. So we're going to spend a little bit of time, not a lot, but just a little bit of time sort of reorienting folks to the whys and wherefores of the genesis of the WAG exception. And then we're going to go through and we're going to highlight for you sort of the changes to the gifts rule. We're going to highlight those things that are new, either provisions that are new or just placements of provisions that are new, so that everybody's aware of what's changed with respect to the widely attended gathering exception.
Yeah, because we did some shuffling around, hopefully to make the regulation clearer, but when you're not accustomed to using the regulation, it's easy to kind of get lost.
Well, and in particular, if you were used to the way it was structured before, sort of reorienting yourself to the new structure, I think is just helpful. And then we have revised the widely attended gatherings analysis worksheet, which a lot of folks say they use and they enjoy. It's a helpful job aid. And so we're basically just going to be using that tool to walk you through the various analysis pieces that you will have to do when you do a widely attended gatherings analysis.
Okay.
And we want to familiarize you with that worksheet because at the end of our broadcast today, we're going to assign you an exercise. And we've sent you that exercise. We've sent you the revised widely attended gathering analysis worksheet. We've sent you a revised travel table. We've sent you the PDF version of the Federal Register notice with the changes to the gifts provisions of the standards of conduct. So on Thursday, we are going to ask you to, or we're going to debrief with you the exercise that we've laid out for you today.
No, that's great, and give us an opportunity to find out if we're familiar enough with the changes to actually apply the new exception, and an opportunity to experiment and practice with the new elements.
Very good.
Great. Shall I pull up the deck?
Yeah, if you could do that, that would be awesome. Yeah, so we're going to start today by doing a little bit of a conversation about the whys and wherefores of the widely attended gathering exception. So we want to start out with just sort of talking about, why does the WAG exception exist? What was in OGE's mind, and what were we thinking when we created this exception?
Yeah, I'd like to remember that it was possible for government officials to attend meetings and similar events prior to 1992.
Yes. Yes, we did not suddenly craft a whole new, positive right for people to attend events that they otherwise had never had an ability to do. If anyone has had an opportunity to read, and we always encourage people to read the preambles to the Federal Register notices when we do new rulemakings. The preamble to I think it is the final issuance of the standards of conduct back in 1992, has a rather extensive discussion of the widely attended gathering exception and sort of the thinking behind it. And I like to remind people that what the widely attended gathering exception recognizes first and foremost is that certain agencies have statutory gift acceptance authority that they can use to accept things like free attendance at events that are happening at someone's duty station. So when you have conferences and when you have events where someone is being comped a waiver of the fee to attend or being comped meals in association with that attendance at that event, agencies that have statutory gift acceptance authority have always then, if their authority reaches to that, have always had the ability to accept those things.
Right. And that makes sense, that we would be able to use our gift acceptance authority where it's available to send people to these things in their official capacities.
Exactly. And so what we tried to do with the widely attended gathering exception is to acknowledge that not all agencies do have statutory gift acceptance authority. So for those agencies that don't, unless there was some other authority like the GSA Travel Authority, 1353, which allows you to accept these free attendance types of things, but only when someone's in travel status.
Right.
And there's another authority, 4111. We're gonna touch on these a little bit later on today too. But there are certain stipulations with when and from whom you can accept offers of free attendance at events under 5 U.S.C. 4111. So there are all these other authorities out there, and what OGE was acknowledging was that there is this sort of missing piece for agencies that don't have statutory gift acceptance authority, where if we created an authority, we wanted to allow those agencies without statutory gift acceptance authority to have a mechanism to be able to accept these offers of free attendance when they thought it was in the agency's interest for their employees to attend.
So there was a sort of a crack in the framework that was preventing agencies, and particularly in this case employees, from attending events that are really in the government's interest for them to attend. But for a variety of reasons, that wasn't possible in these limited circumstances. So we created the WAG exception to assist agencies in managing those situations.
Yes.
And I think the trouble people get into is that sort of decision to fill the crack, to fill in that gap, has become the way we do these things.
Right.
Right. And it creates all sorts of complications for the agency and the employees when we sort of over apply WAG.
And I think that's exactly it, is that I think that it's a matter for people to really understand where WAG fits in vis-a-vis the other authorities, such that you don't always automatically have to go, or maybe even in some instances, maybe you really shouldn't go to the WAG, that maybe it would be more appropriate, for example, for you to use your own statutory gift acceptance authority, if you have it, to send your person in their official capacity on official duty time as an official duty activity.
Right.
And you just accept the gift of free attendance under your statutory authority. There's absolutely nothing that prevents you from doing that. And in fact, it was just understood that agencies who had statutory gift acceptance authority were presumably doing that. Yeah,
and we presumed in 1992 that they would continue to do so.
Right.
And over time, I think, a lot of it is the convenience of process. We establish processes for vetting widely attended gatherings, so that becomes the way we do them.
The default way.
The default way, because there's a form, and I know where it is on the intranet or whatever. But it does create some difficulties, because again, when people are attending gatherings, they're accepting this gift personally.
Right.
Right. This isn't the agency accepting the gift, and that creates reporting burden, and sort of all sorts of other considerations.
Yeah, and we have the gyrations of that they can't be there on official duty time, so there has to be excused absence, or it has to be on otherwise without it can be without charge to leave, but it has to be on administrative leave or excused absence. So So this is just a kind of a reminder. So when to use the widely attended gathering exception? Well, when you don't have statutory agency gift acceptance authority, or your authority doesn't allow for you to accept these kinds of things, or, when there aren't other authorities that would apply, or maybe the other authorities wouldn't be quite appropriate.
So our order of operations, we should see if other authorities are appropriate and available, and if they are, use them, and where we've exhausted those possibilities, only then go to the widely attended gathering exception.
I think that is a way to approach it. And I think that what we're encouraging folks to do is to be thoughtful about when you're using WAG, and make sure that it really is the appropriate authority to be using in each and every circumstance where you're being offered a gift of free attendance.
Excellent.
Okay. So as we were just mentioning this earlier, and we've actually included, this is part of the analysis that's in the widely attended gathering analysis worksheet that we're going to be walking through in a minute. But just kind of as a brief reminder, these are some of the other authorities that we're referring to when we say, that you should be conferring or consulting other authorities before making a determination. So your agency gift acceptance authority, 1353, which as we all know is the GSA travel reg, 5 USC 4111, which is for meetings, and it's the Government Employees Training Act. And then, of course, the Foreign Gifts and Decorations Act, which is 5 USC 7342. Right.
It's important to think about these, because in some cases, like in the case of 1353, the use of the authority is compulsory. If you're going to accept a travel payment. So, it's good to keep these in mind.
Right. So why don't we start at the beginning with respect to the gifts analysis? We have crafted a new chart to sort of give everybody sort of an overarching sensibility about how you do a gifts analysis, whether it's a widely attended gathering exception analysis, a free attendance gift analysis, or any gift. So Patrick, I know that you helped work on this. You want to sort of just kind of give us the schematic here?
Well, we added a few spheres. So now with more spheres. No, I think some of this should look very familiar to folks, but the leftmost portion of this chart is a little bit different. And this is a function of recent changes to Subpart B of the standards. And essentially what we've done is, as sort of a preface for examining whether a gift may be accepted using an exclusion or an exception, ask first a prudential question, and that's whether it's even a good idea to try and accept the gift. And the question that we encourage employees to ask themselves is, would their impartiality or integrity be questioned were they to accept this gift? And regardless of anything that might come afterwards, if it would be, it's probably not a good idea to accept the gift, so it should not be accepted.
Okay.
And where we've decided that prudential considerations don't agitate in the direction of declining the gift, we have a process that allows us to analyze whether an exclusion or exception may be appropriate in that circumstance.
Okay. So we've got this prefatory piece that we're going to talk about here in a second. And then the gift analysis after that is, you ask yourself, is the thing actually a gift? Because we have exclusions from the definition of a gift.
That's
so
right.
We want to make sure that whatever the person's being offered is actually considered a gift because if it's not a gift, it's not subject to the prohibitions.
That's right.
So once we've decided it's a gift, then we ask ourselves, okay, well, is it prohibited? So then we look at the two prongs of the prohibition, and then if we decide that it isn't prohibited, you can accept the gift. If you decide that it is prohibited, then we can avail ourselves of the exceptions, and then we make a determination about whether any of the exceptions apply. So that part of the analysis has not changed at all. The only piece we're really adding is this prudential piece that goes in the front. So let's talk a little bit about this prudential piece. This new piece it comes before the prohibitions, before the statement of the prohibitions in the regulation, and it's located at 2635.201B. In a nutshell, it says employees should consider declining otherwise permissible gifts if they believe a reasonable person with knowledge of the relevant facts would question the employee's integrity or impartiality as a result of accepting the gift. So what are the factors really that we're asking employees to consider, Patrick?
So we sort of lay this out as a framework for considering whether or not it would be prudent to accept the gift. Things we should think about are the value of the gift. Is it an expensive gift? Is it is it extraordinary for the circumstance, or is it a relatively small value gift? The timing, right? Is the gift given at a time such that it appears that it might be given with the goal of influencing some government action or the employee in some way? The identity of the donor. Who is the donor and what's their relationship to the employee's work and the agency? And access. And I think this is a really important one, is that does this gift or the acceptance of this gift provide disparate access to certain groups of citizens that is not available to other citizens who are not offering similar things? And I think this is always something we've kind of thought about around the edges, but here we're making it really clear that gifts given with the intention of securing access that would be otherwise unavailable should be looked at very carefully from a prudential perspective, because that sort of gift has the potential to have a corrosive effect on the public's trust and the perception of the government's fairness in its decision-making and processes. So I think these are really good. This is probably not an exhaustive list of things that you might consider when determining whether your impartiality or integrity might be questioned, but they do provide a really good framework to start thinking about it.
Well, and I think particularly in the context of widely attended gatherings, you're talking about people whose presence at an event is being underwritten by another entity or individual. And the types of events that typically people get invited to are quite often events where one of the underlying purposes of the event is for there to be some sort of access.
Right.
And I think that that's all the more reason why we have to be exercise some caution when we look at the nature of the events, and we build actually some of this into the widely attended gathering determination as well. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, about when you're looking at the agency interest and whether the agency interest outweighs any appearance concerns. We're really taking into account there very similar issues as what you're asking the employee to do on the front end of the analysis here, which is to say that we are concerned about influence. We are concerned about undue influence, not necessarily corrupt giving practices, but things that are designed to enable greater access and thereby greater influence.
Right. And I think, what we're getting at fundamentally here is managing the fairness of government processes.
Right.
The government belongs to the citizens and it belongs to them equally.
Mm-hmm.
And things that detract from that or appear to sort of contravene that sort of assumption that we operate under may not be a good idea. And
Right.
we want to consider that when we're making these decisions.
Okay. So why is this, we call it a paradigm shift. Why is this important, Patrick?
Well, I think, as you sort of say here, it changes the default, and defaults are important. So basically what we're saying and codifying is, first, don't accept gifts that would have a corrosive effect on your integrity and impartiality, right? That's the default, is that we don't accept gifts, and especially not in cases where there would be a negative effect on the integrity and impartiality of the employee in their work. The focus changes here. We're talking about not can I accept it, not is there a legal way to accept this thing, but is it appropriate for me to accept this? And if I am to accept this, what will be the consequences for the agency or myself and my work? And I think that's really an important difference, because I think before we changed this, and I think it maybe happened over time, there's almost this perception that the gift exceptions created a right to accept something. And we did have that line in the old regulation that says it's always appropriate to decline a gift. But that was sort of it
was almost like a toss away. It was like a second thought or something.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think we're reasserting as sort of forcefully as the regulation will allow us that prudential considerations should always be forefront, and that these exceptions should be used in cases where there isn't going to be any degradation to the integrity or impartiality of the employee, the work, or the agency. And it also asks employees to think differently.
Yes.
Right.
That's exactly it.
To balance, not just, I think in sort of the old framework, it was easy for employees to say that this is $19, so I can have it.
Right.
Right. And what we're asking here is to say, well, whose interests are affected? Right. Is this fair to all of our agency stakeholders? Would citizens looking at our operations find this to be objectionable in some ways? So really to think more broadly about what it is you're doing and who would be affected, and whether or not that's a good thing for the agency or the government as a whole.
Well, I think that is exactly it. So it becomes an other focus as well. Like you're focusing on others. You're not just focusing on yourself. When it becomes a question of can I accept this legally, it becomes all about you, the individual employee. It's all about me. Can I take it? Can I take it? If I take it, will I get in trouble? It's all about kind of me. When you take the focus off of the legal consideration, like is it legal or isn't it, and you start focusing on the prudential, you start saying, how does this look to other people?
Right.
Irrespective of the ramifications for you personally, what is the fallout to the agency? If people think that this is untoward, notwithstanding that it doesn't happen to be illegal, what are the ramifications of that on the agency, on the program, on people's perception of the integrity of the agency's programs? So you start taking a much broader focus and a much less sort of individual, liability, legal focus.
Right. And I think, we're both trainers, and I think there's a great training opportunity here. So when you talk to employees about this regulation, this part of the rule, you can help employees practice determining if a gift might compromise their integrity or impartiality. And you can do a lot of that, and where you come to a conclusion that their impartiality and integrity are not going to be questioned, you can go on to see if an exception might permit someone to participate. But by setting the default in this position, we can really put that up at the forefront, and maybe weed out some of those less desirable legal analyses where, we can squeeze it within the rule, but man, does it look bad.
Right.
We can sort of dispense with those before we look at the exceptions specifically.
Right. So, OGE obviously has some intentionality here, and we had some idea of how we thought the change to the Subpart B framework might, like what those results might look like. And I do think that we saw this as assisting agency ethics officials who, how many of you out there have had this, issue where you get somebody who comes in for advice and the question is, can I accept this gift? Or where does it say that I can't do this?
Right.
And you get the armchair legal, lawyer from your lawyer employees, and then you wind up feeling pressured to, make it fit. And this, these considerations are just so much more than just a strictly four corners of the law analysis, and the ramifications of it are much more than just a strictly, is it or isn't it a violation of rule or law. So I think if we can begin to encourage our employees to seriously undertake the 201B sort of and internalize it, we may very well relieve some of that pressure from you all to have to be, justifying through an explicit, citation to law why someone can or can't accept, or why someone should or shouldn't accept a gift.
And this isn't a radical departure from precedent. This very much uses a similar decision-making framework to Subpart E of the standards that we've been living and working with for decades. So, I don't think this is a huge sea change, and it's probably something we should have been doing anyway.
Right.
But we're really just making it explicit here, just like we do in Subpart E, that look, things that erode the integrity of the government aren't a good idea, or things you probably shouldn't do. Right. That's not a really radical idea.
I think one of the expectations was that there may be fewer gifts being accepted, or at the very least less as you were alluding to earlier, less problematic gifts being accepted, if people have a better sensibility about prudential advice as opposed to strictly legal advice. And we're just hoping that this will redound to sort of that this will spread to other areas of ethical decision making, so that if we begin in an area that I think most employees are familiar with to begin with. I think if they're familiar with any part of the standards of conduct, a lot of employees, the gifts regs, they seem to know pretty well. So if we start there, then our hope is that will spread to sort of like all of their conduct, so that in other instantiations where it doesn't involve a gift per se, maybe involves misuse of position or something, that they will have that kind of sensibility that's informing their decision making.
And I think we're also here being considerate of the adverse consequences and how they affect agencies, right? Because the thing that you should be afraid of when you're going to events that provide disparate access or accepting gifts that are problematic is that there's an erosion of the agency's reputation, of the government's reputation. There may be criticism from the outside. And all of those things are things that exist external to the framework of the rules and any penalties that they might prescribe. And those are things that are really harmful to the agencies. So we want, with that external focus, to think about those things before we act.
So what are the actual mechanics then of applying these factors? I think people need to be clear about what our expectation is about how these will actually be incorporated into the decision-making process.
So generally, we're asking employees to do this, right? Similar to Subpart E, we don't want this to be a gotcha where the agency comes around behind the employee and says, well, you accepted an otherwise permissible gift, but we disagree with your prudential analysis, so we're going to penalize you. So the goal is that the employees internalize this and apply it themselves. Certainly, just like with Subpart E, if they would like the assistance of an ethics official in making these determinations, that's what ethics officials are for. And in these limited instances, in some cases, the exception requires the ethics official to assist in that determination and actually to document it. So yeah, those are kind of the two ideas, because we're trying to split the difference here. We don't want an open-ended subjective prohibition that we can run around sort of beating people with as a club, but we also want to make sure that this decision-making process is taking place and is being respected by the employee and the agency.
And I do want to point out explicitly, we have that in that first bullet point there, that like 204H, which is the social invitation exception, and 204M, which are the materials, I believe, exception. It's the new materials exception. Those are two exceptions where the ethics official is explicitly required to engage in this analysis. So so just kind of heads up about that there are certain provisions in exceptions in the standards where it's expected that you will do that analysis. So if we look at the factors and what the factors are, I just kind of want to repeat these because these would be the things that we would be looking at, for example, when we're doing a widely attended gathering analysis, sort of like the precursor analysis to your full-blown legal analysis. If we apply to a 1B, we would be looking at first, what's the value of the gift that's being offered?
Right. So
is the value of free attendance, is it something that's really swanky and expensive, or is it something that's relatively inexpensive?
Right.
Is the gift given at a time when the donor is seeking or has business before the agency? I think this is a really critical one, Patrick.
I agree, yes.
What do you think?
No, I think this is in some ways, this for events, this is kind of the crux of it. And this is going to be interrelated with access. Is that, really is this thing an attempt to nudge or cajole or influence an active decision-making process? And if the timing suggests that, we should be really, really careful, especially if it's a sensitive process.
So in keeping with that then too, is the donor someone who has interest that can be affected by the employee's official duties? So on the one hand, we want to be looking at, from the timing standpoint, we want to be looking at kind of, is the agency undertaking a process that is sensitive enough such that having affiliations with entities that can be affected by that process, it's probably not a good thing to be seen, accepting gifts from and or socializing with them. But then it gets even worse, frankly, if the donor is someone who actually, or if the employee is someone who actually has duties in connection with that matter, where the employee, him or herself, can actually sort of affect the outcome of that matter. And then finally, it's the access issue that we talked about before, which, is the gift going to provide the donor with significantly disproportionate access to the employee and the agency? And this is a big one. It really is. I think we have to look at what it appears is happening by way of giving certain entities a leg up because you're giving them an opportunity to sort of pigeonhole or otherwise have access to our employees.
And I think these are very helpful because they allow us to easily imagine kind of a spectrum of gifts, a set of gifts being totally benign, in the context of an event, something that has a very low value, that isn't timed to coincide with any agency action, that's given by someone who isn't interested at all in the employee's duties one way or the other, and doesn't provide a special kind of access. And on the other side, you could imagine an event, a very fancy, expensive event that is timed to coincide with a sensitive government matter that the employee is personally working on and may be in charge of, and is being offered by someone who has a significant interest in that matter, and it provides very limited access to that individual and to the event. And we can kind of operate between those poles to try and help us decide when it's appropriate to move forward with a full WAG analysis.
Yeah, and I think this is one thing that, again, talk about an educational moment. I really do think for some of your employees who are very active WAG participants, and I know that certain agencies, you just have certain employees who are more apt to be invited to these types of events, that it would be very useful to sort of educate them about this, that when they get an invitation into an event, ask them, to consider going through this kind of an analysis first before they bring it to you for an analysis. Because again, we're gonna look at this when we get to the WAG analysis worksheet. When you have to do your written authorization, part of the consideration you have to have is whether or not the agency's interest in their attendance outweighs any appearance concerns. And these types of things are obviously going to be factors to be considered. So if the employee on the front end can sort of be making that kind of cautionary determination, in some instances, it can save you from having to ultimately do any kind of analysis, because the employee will themselves have decided, given the timing, given what's going on, given my role in it, given who's asking me, maybe it's not a very good idea for me to go to this thing.
And a thing that I really appreciate about these factors, especially in the WAG context, is I remember before you'd have events that seemed to be set up in a way as to kind of game the WAG rule.
Yes.
And you'd look at it and you said, that just looks terrible. But, obviously the person who's providing the invitation has sort of looked at the process, and, there's an attempt somehow to sort of get around the what would be the prudential decision-making aspect. And here, by putting it up front, that kind of thing becomes less beneficial. So hopefully we'll see less of that in the future.
Okay, so that's the 201B, sort of like overview of the 201B provisions, which are new to the standards of conduct, the GIST provisions. We also have a new, well, I say the provision isn't new, but what we have done is we've moved G1, what we've referred to as the G1 provision in the shorthand, which is the free attendance on the day that the employee is presenting information, speaking or otherwise presenting information on behalf of the agency. And that used to be housed right next to the widely attended gathering exception. And all we have done, folks, is we've moved it. We've moved it from 204, which is where the exceptions reside, to the 203 section, which is where the exclusions from the definition of a gift reside, and the definitions are. So 203B8, we've created an additional exclusion from the definition, which is effectively what G1 always was. And what we do is we explicitly make it part of that list of exclusions to the definition of a gift. And what we've done there, as well as we've included in that exclusion both the fact that it covers the employee, the extent to which it covers a spouse or guest, and then the extent to which it can also encompass or cover an employee who is accompanying the speaker or presenter to the event. So that's all housed in the same location now, and the location is now under the exclusions from the definition of a gift at 203B8.
And I really appreciate this change. I think the location of this exclusion in the exception for widely attended gatherings gave the impression that OGE was sort of creating the special authority of agencies to allow their people to attend events for the purpose of giving a speech. And what it really is it reflects our understanding that agencies sometimes have organic authority to send people to talk places. And when they exercise that authority to send someone to an event and that person experiences the event as a consequence of engaging in the speaking activity, that there's no gift there. And it's really our understanding. So you can sort of think about this, that there's really no gift there. This isn't an authority that you use to accept a gift. It's an understanding that there isn't a gift when someone attends an event for the purposes of speaking. That doesn't take away agencies' management discretion to say that you're not staying for the concert afterwards, or we'd like you just to attend for the morning when you're speaking and not the afternoon where they're having the circus performer. Right? Because they're attending in their official capacity. So the agency maintains managerial control over the employee for the duration. And that's fine, and as it should be. So we're not creating any new rights or responsibilities. We're just acknowledging that reality.
The next thing that's new, which again is not that it's the provision itself isn't new, it's just been moved, and that is the definition of free attendance. The definition of free attendance, again, used to be housed in the exception for a widely attended gatherings, and what we have done instead, in an effort to be consistent, is to move that definition of free attendance into the definition section, imagine that, where it rightfully belongs. So it's now located at 2635.203G. It doesn't change anything else about it except that it just puts that definition in a different location, and that free attendance is the definition you use for purposes of the widely attended gathering exception, as well as for purposes of the exclusion from the definition of a gift for free attendance on days that you are presenting information or speaking on behalf of the agency. And it's just that simple. So having highlighted the new stuff, we want to sort of walk you through the WAG analysis that you'll be doing with your exercise using the WAG analysis worksheet. We've made some changes to the worksheet, not a ton of changes, but we've tried to make it reflect more adequately sort of the information that is now in the regulation and some stipulations that have come out by way of legal advisories. What I do want to inform you, though, is we do think that the first step, as we mentioned before, we do think the first step is to encourage employees to do this impartiality, integrity analysis under 201B. We haven't included that on the worksheet because that's not really your analysis to undertake per se, unless the employee asks you to. But we do want to remind you that even in the context of widely attended gatherings, employees should be encouraged to do the 201B analysis, which is, would my impartiality or integrity be questioned if I were to accept this offer of free attendance, and with the following factors: value, timing, identity, and access. So let's jump into the WAG worksheet. We've given you all a copy of the WAG worksheet. And the first page should not look terribly different from the old worksheet. It's mostly been a matter of tweaking things here and there, and giving you new citations as to where these things can be found. But the WAG worksheet basically follows that schematic that Patrick and I walked you through before, which is, when you're doing a gifts analysis, you start with, is it a gift and what is being offered? So on the first page of the WAG worksheet at 1.1 and 1.2, we're basically asking you what gifts are being offered. And we want to know, is there a gift of free attendance? And we walk you through what the things are that would constitute a gift of free attendance that would be subject to the widely attended gathering analysis. Then we also ask you to consider whether or not there are other gifts that can't be offered or that can't be accepted under the widely attended gathering exception. And we ask you to explicitly make some decisions about whether or not any of those other gifts might be subject to these other authorities. Now, based on what Patrick and I said in the very beginning of this session, I would encourage you to consider these other authorities as well, even if all your employees being offered is a gift of free attendance. Because again, it may very well be that there are circumstances where it would be more appropriate for your employee to attend the event on official duty time as part of an official duty activity. And if you have agency gift acceptance authority, it would be more appropriate for you to accept the free attendance under that gift acceptance authority, rather than resorting to a widely attended gathering exception analysis, having them go on excused absence or administrative leave, having them be there in this quasi sort of official, way, and jumping through all those hoops.
Yeah, and I think that ambiguity is underappreciated. That when someone's attending a WAG, they are attending in their personal capacity. They're not attending as a representative of the agency, but they are also there because the agency thinks it's in its interest for them to attend. And that's not without its challenges. Mm-hmm. And simply sending someone where you can in their official capacity, where appropriate, relieves a lot of that ambiguity.
Mm-hmm. So again, we're not telling you that you absolutely can't use the WAG if you have statutory gift acceptance authority. That is not what we're saying. But what we are saying is, if you do have statutory gift acceptance authority, you should consider whether or not that may not be the more appropriate authority to use for certain participation of certain officials at certain events for certain purposes.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to page 2 then of the WAG worksheet. And this is what it looks like. We've changed this up just a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about how we've changed it up and sort of how the regulation is worded, because the regulation is a little bit strange in this way, and we kind of went back and forth about how to structure the worksheet. We start out with, the gathering itself, the nature of the gathering itself has to meet the widely attended gathering exception, and that has to be part of your written authorization, which is it a widely attended gathering?
Right.
So what are we talking about? We want to know what is the size and type of the gathering, and we list sort of the criteria on the WAG worksheet as to what are the things that you should consider in determining if it's a widely attended gathering. Are there a large number of people who will attend? Is there going to be a diversity of views? Will there be opportunity for the exchange of ideas and views among invited persons? Okay. Now, one thing I did want to point out to you all is this opportunity for exchange of ideas and views among invited persons. That didn't used to be actually in the body of the regulation before. That used to be only reside in that very extensive, widely attended gathering legal advisory that we issued.
Right.
We have since incorporated it into the language of the regulation itself. So that is an element in the determination about whether or not something is a widely attended gathering.
Right. And I've gotten some questions about that opinion since the update to the regulation. And you do see in a number of places where we have taken guidance from that and included it in the regulation. And that is what we did. We didn't. It's not a big change. It's just to sort of clarify within the regulation that guidance is accurate.
So under G2, all of these things are present, and that's what we're asking you to sort of check the box off of in box 2.1 on page 2 of the widely attended gathering worksheet. Then in box 2.2 and 2.3 is where we move on to the determination of agency interest. And as you'll see, that we have one box which just basically says, is the employee's attendance in the agency's interest, because it will further the programs and operations of the agency. And we see that as kind of just, that's a very general threshold determination, because that has to be established before you can authorize the person to attend. And that's even before you get to this balancing, the weighing and balancing of whether or not that it outweighs the appearance concern. You have to fully establish what the agency's interest is in the employee's attendance at this event.
Right. What's the reason for them to go?
So with the determination of agency interest, that's going to be part of your written authorization. So at G3, all G3 talks about in the regulation is sort of like that you need to craft a written authorization for any employee to avail themselves of the widely attended gathering exception, that it's the agency designee that will be making this written authorization. And among the things that you have to establish, or that is part of that written authorization, is the agency's interest. In addition to that, other things that have to be in the written authorization is whether or not the employee's attendance outweighs the concern that the employee may appear to be improperly influenced in the performance of their official duties, and also if the person is other than the sponsor of the event. And we're going to get to those determinations in a minute, but I just want you to understand at G3, what G3 is doing is saying this is what has to be in the written authorization. In order for you to do a written authorization, you have to show that it's a widely attended gathering, that the attendance is in the interest of the agency, that interest outweighs any appearance concerns, and that and establishing that if it's not from the sponsor of the event, that the gathering meets all of the criteria for a non-sponsor.
Yeah, I think G3 also provides us a really good reason to use the widely attended gatherings worksheet, because it helps us ensure that we have made and engaged in all of the things that we're required to consider before making the determination. So, if you thought this was useful before, it's even more useful now.
Yes. So I do want you to be very thoughtful, and particularly in the exercise that we're going to do, because we have it as a separate element in the analysis worksheet. So we are going to ask you to really consider, how would an employee's attendance necessarily further the programs and operations of the agency? And, while OGE certainly doesn't make that determination for you, and typically we do not second guess agency's determination of agency interest, because your programs and operations far better than we could ever hope to. We just wanted to give you some indicia of things that things you might want to consider as being material to this kind of a determination.
Right.
So, is it an opportunity for the agency to share important information? And is the group that's going to be there the kind of group that is appropriate to receive this information?
Right. If you're, publicizing some agency initiative and it's important to communicate with key stakeholders and those people happen to be assembled, using that opportunity seems like a good idea, right? Or something that at least agitates in the direction of it being within the agency's interest.
Oftentimes if the agency is engaging in a new rulemaking, or if the agency has, staked out a new position on something or has a new initiative, there are certain events where maybe it's an opportunity for the agency to reach a very wide audience and be able to publicly sort of, or publicize or further, sort of spread the news about whatever the latest initiative is.
Absolutely. And there are lots of things that we do in government where it's very important that the people who need to know about those new requirements or opportunities are made aware of them, and to use opportunities where people are assembled to publicize or clarify. Very, very helpful.
And I think that we also recognize that sometimes it's important not just for the agency to disseminate information, but it's also important for the agency to gather information. So we fully recognize that there are often times when you want to send your people to an event because the other people who are there are in possession of information that would be very helpful. and useful to the people in your organization.
Right, exactly. So if the work of your agency affects a group of stakeholders, those people happen to be assembled, and you want to learn more about their concerns, their perspectives, their interests, that's something that we often need to do.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I don't want to belabor this, but I think it's really important that you spend a considerable amount of time making sure that you and whoever else you think needs to be involved in this. I mean, for example, at OGE, our process is that when an employee wants to attend an event, for which they're receiving an offer free attendance, we go to the supervisor first, and the supervisor helps to make the determination of agency interest before I, as the ethics official, actually go through the rest of the WAG analysis. But I think it's really important that everybody who is involved in this understands that the agency interest is sort of paramount here. So then, after you've established, or after we've asked you the question of agency interest, we get to the next part of the reg, which is 204G4, and it's a 204G4 where you are asked to do this balancing test between the agency's interest and the potential appearance concerns of having the employee participate. And these are the factors that we've given you to consider, and we've outlined those. We've actually put those into the chart itself so that they're right there for you as you're going through your analysis.
It's very similar to the prudential determination that employees do, but kind of on steroids. It's more specific to the type of gift, the gift of free attendance, but is a very similar line of thinking.
So, I mean, I think the couple of things that I want to sort of point your attention to, because I think that they're not brand new, but they may be articulated really for the first time. We're concerned about making sure that acceptance of free attendance at an event and sort of the nature of the event itself is not going to create the appearance of preferential treatment to the donor. I think this is one of the biggest concerns we have with a lot of widely attended gatherings, is because, as you all know, oftentimes, your employee can be sort of singled out or targeted by prohibited sources to sort of get all the attention, as it were, or certain entities are getting, greater access to your employee than other entities, other similarly situated entities. So I think we always have to be mindful of, okay, what is the nature of the event? Who's going to be there? Who's bearing the cost of my person being there? Is this giving an untoward amount, or appears to be giving this donor an untoward amount of access to my person? And again, and that kind of goes hand in hand with 7 is the government providing persons with views or interests that differ from the donor with access to the government? So it's kind of like, again, this gets to the what is the playing field?
Right.
What is the diversity of interests that are going to be present at this event?
Right. And are there opportunities for people who are not in that group, who might be interested in similar matters, to access the government to make their opinions and views known?
Exactly. So these are all considerations that we expect you to sort of take very seriously and be focusing on when you're making the determination that it's in the interest of the agency for the employee, and so much so that it outweighs any appearance concerns. So the next page of the WAG worksheet covers the sponsor of the event. And what we've done in block 3.1, for your convenience, is once you've identified who you think the sponsor of the event is, we've included those indicia of sponsorship that we issued in our legal advisory 1704. So when you're talking about who is the sponsor of the event, we've given you in box 3.1 the things that we outlined in that legal advisory. So we're trying to clarify for everybody what constitutes a sponsor and what isn't a sponsor.
It's a little less than intuitive, so I think it's important that we included those here for your convenience, because I think sometimes people have a difficulty with that concept because it seems to differ from the plain language meaning of sponsor.
Yes.
So rely upon them.
Yeah, and I think that when you look at this laundry list, it's, when we talk about sponsor, probably the better word to use for what we're really trying to get at is the host. Who is hosting the event? And by that we mean, are they responsible for organizing it, planning it, or conducting it? Do they have the administrative responsibilities for notifying people, for coming up with the guest list? Are they determining the agenda of the event, like the topics to be covered and who's going to come speak and the date and the location? Are they the primary point of contact? I mean, so are they the people who are in charge of making sure that they do the registration and they know they're doing the RSVPing and they're taking care of that whole logistical aspect of it? What we want you to understand is that for our purposes, we don't think a sponsor of the event is someone who's providing financial support only.
Exclusively, merely financial support.
Merely financial support. If all they're doing is underwriting the event with financial support, even though they get called sponsors, they get called gold sponsors and silver sponsors and platinum sponsors and friend of the whatever sponsors. But that doesn't make them a sponsor for purposes of the widely attended gathering exception. So when you're making that determination, just keep those points in mind, and hopefully it's a little clearer now than it used to be.
Yeah. No, and I think this is a challenge from a drafting perspective, in that there isn't one perfect word, right? Using a host comes with its own set of problems, because you have someone who's providing the venue and we say we're hosted by them, but actually someone else is the organizer. So, well, maybe the organizer is appropriate. So, well, we've hired an organizer. So it's really just important to understand that the words that the organizers of the event use to describe people are not very useful for us. And what you really have to do is look at who is offering the thing and see if these criteria apply to them.
And then that's what we want to find out, because what we're really trying to drive at is we want to know who is bearing the cost of the employee's attendance, and is that person or entity the sponsor or a sponsor? Because sometimes there are multiple sponsors of an event. Okay, and now, as we all know, if it's a non-sponsor, then we have an additional set of criteria that have to be met about the event itself. And that is that there have to be more than 100 persons in it expected to attend the event. And the market value of the gift of free attendance is, now this is new because the dollar threshold has just gone up. It used to be $375 or less, and now it is $390 or less. So that just went into effect, I think, in May, I think is when that went into effect. So we're looking at, for non-sponsor events, are there 100 people expected to be in attendance, and will the value of free attendance be $390 or less? So then on the fourth page of the WAG worksheet, we're talking about sponsors and guests. And here, again, we want to know, has the invitation been offered to a spouse or other guest? One thing I like to point out here that I know that I run up against myself in my own practice here at OGE is the question of if the invitation is silent on whether or not a spouse or guest is included, how to handle that.
Yeah. Do you go back and say, can I bring my spouse?
And I mean, you can't solicit a gift. And if the employee goes back and says, can I bring my spouse, or is my spouse invited, or is a guest invited, then that has the sort of patina of a solicitation
there.
The way that we have handled it here is that someone other than the invitee, myself, namely, have called the organizer to let them know I am the ethics official, and that I simply need to know whether or not people in attendance are being allowed to bring guests and spouses, or whether or not the invitation is intended to be only for the person who received the invitation. And that has been at least a good way to sort of handle those. But I think you want to make sure that your employees understand that they really shouldn't be going back and seeking clarification about whether or not they can bring a spouse or guest, as that may redound to a solicitation.
Or other upgrades to the invitation.
Right, true.
Yeah. Is this for the big table at the front of the room? Because
do I get a swag bag? Yeah.
So no, it's something to be careful about, because we sometimes overlook that provision that prohibits solicitation.
So, the things that you have to consider is whether or not other people in attendance are also going to be accompanied by a spouse or guest, and, whether or not the invitation to the spouse is coming from a sponsor or non-sponsor of the event. And then the same rules apply there, which is 100 people or more are expected to attend. And then the total cost of the attendance of both the employee and the guest cannot exceed $390. So it has to be $390 or less. So really, as you can see from the WAG worksheet, there's not a whole lot that has really changed substantially in what we've done with the widely attended gathering. Most of it has been, I think, a restructuring, a clarifying. One thing that is paramount, though, is that you do understand all of your determinations have to be in writing. They didn't used to have to be. They could be orally or in writing. Now they're all have to be written determinations. And then the one final thing that I always like to remind folks of is because under the widely attended gathering exception, the employee, him or herself, is accepting the gift in their personal capacity. This means that if it meets the reporting threshold for either the 278, the public financial disclosure form, or the confidential financial disclosure form, the 450, they may be required to disclose the free attendance on one of their financial disclosure forms. So we're looking at $390 per source, but you can pull out any item that's $156 or less, can be pulled out of the aggregation. And there are certain items that are excluded from reporting requirements under 2634.105H4. So you might want to take a look at some of the exclusions from the filing requirements to see if anything that was offered under the free attendance is eligible for one of the exclusions. But I always just like to remind folks that as you're keeping track of your WAGs, you may also want to be keeping track of them for purposes of financial disclosure. And
Great.
I think, okay.
No, and I think this is very, very helpful, because while the regulation, as you go through the text of the new regulation, it seems quite different. Kind of walking through the process, we see that a lot of this is very familiar, and that we're not in a totally different world. We're in a slightly different world, and that these changes are manageable, and we just have to be aware of them as we move forward with the regs. And I guess we'll have an opportunity on Thursday to see how our proficiency is going with these new provisions.
Now, you all should have received an exercise. It is a sample email from a person from the Governmental Affairs Vice President for Advocacy Now to an employee. I would like you to use the widely attended gathering analysis sheet to sort of walk through an analysis for the facts that you were given. If you've had a chance to look at that email, you will see that it is very short on facts. So one of the challenges that you're going to face is sort of coming up with a series of questions of, what information do you have? What additional information do you need?
Right.
But on Thursday, Patrick and I are going to walk you through that analysis worksheet with those facts. And we're going to try to come up with a way to make it a little bit more interactive on Thursday. I think if we can, rather than it just be sort of a Q&A thing, I think we're interested in knowing exactly what your thinking is and what your questions are and what your analysis is. So I would ask you to please on Thursday come prepared to either share that over the phone or
let's be thinking about it.
Or be thinking about it. So that it isn't just a matter of Patrick and I talking at you with an analysis, but it actually gives you an ability to engage in that analysis as well.
Okay.
Do we have any questions on the phone? We would be happy to take any questions that anyone has at the moment.
Thank you. If you would like to ask a question, unmute your phone and press star followed by the number 1. And when prompted, record your name clearly so we may introduce you. To withdraw your question, press star 2. Again, to ask a question, star 1. It'll take a few moments for questions to come in. Please stand by.
Okay.
And as we're waiting for our first question, I'd like to invite the folks who are on the video broadcast. If you have a burning question at the conclusion of today's presentation, you can submit that to trainingregistrations@oge.gov, and we will try and address those first thing on Thursday morning.
Okay, so that's training registrations
at oge.gov.
At oge.gov. Yes, and we will address those on Thursday morning. Well, before we get started.
Thursday afternoon.
The debrief.
Yes.
Yeah, before
first
we get started
thing Thursday
on the debrief.
afternoon. Yes.
Yeah.
And do we have any questions, Holly?
I show no questions at this time, but again, as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, press star followed by the number 1.
Okay. I'd also just like to remind folks that we did provide you with a PDF of the new regulation.
Yes, we did.
This is something that I've been guilty of a few times, is that I really like my little blue book, and it is no longer very useful for dealing with GIF questions. I find this rather frustrating, but it's important to remember to look at the current version of the regulation.
Yes, it is.
Okay, well, if folks don't have any questions, if you think of anything, feel free to email us, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday for part 2 of the widely attended gathering massive open online course.
Thanks very much, everyone.